All right, guys. Well, new country, new me. We are in Malaysia. It is a beautiful country. We landed yesterday, and it was kind of a chill day. It was a long flight, but today we're going to a trade show and also exploring a little bit of a town. So as you can see, we're here at the main park, right by the Petronas buildings, famous Petronas Twin Towers. There used to be the highest buildings in all of Asia. Now there's even a taller building. You can't see it from here, but there's a taller building in Malaysia now, but they're still the tallest twin buildings. And of course, this is where Malaysian National Oil and Gas Company Petronas is stationed. This is their headquarters. They control all of the production in Malaysia, and they rule from here. It's a beautiful, beautiful buildings, and as you can see, there's a fantastic little park around here with the waterfalls. Very scenic, serene place. So we have a few hours of free time, so I think we're gonna zip to a museum. I think the first one we're gonna try to check out is gonna be the Museum of Malaysian History. It's the main one in all of Malaysia here in Kuala Lumpur. So let's go check it out. I'll show you the road on the way and a little bit of what is life like in Malaysia. Let's go. You know, Kuala Lumpur is a very modern and developing city as the rest of Malaysia. Look, you can see the skyscrapers here. It's quite a beautiful place. Look at that. All right, guys, so we're in front of the National Museum of Malaysia. It is quite a interesting building in itself, but I'm really excited to see what kind of artifacts we can find inside. I wonder how far they go, because Malaysia has such a rich and long history that changed so much over the last 2,000 years. It went from being a Hindu stronghold to becoming a Muslim caliphate, to then going through different colonization periods. So let's go see what we can find. Well, here we are at the entrance to the National Museum of Malaysia. As you can see, there's beautiful, I think, mosaic murals to the side of it, sort of depicting some of the changes that Malaysia went. We can see different years there, the 15, 16, yeah, everywhere basically from the 15th century going up. As you can see, the first instance is the Islamization of Malaysia. Then there's a portrayal of different colonization. So first the Spanish came in the 16th century. No, 15th century Spanish came. Then the Dutch came 100 years later, and then the British came and stayed for almost 100 years, and that was the lengthiest of all of colonization processes. In fact, as a result, much of Malaysia's sort of way of life, it still has that shadow of British rule. As you can see, even the roads are on the opposite side as you can see in Britain. So pretty interesting. All right, let's go in. Here we can see the history of how this land has formed. See, 225 million years ago, then the land started moving and slowly morphing into the present state that we know today. There we are. Oh, wow, look at that. Oh, this is interesting. Look at that. So here we have Homo erectus, one of the early humanoid species. This is from 500,000 years ago. Almost 500,000 years ago. Can you imagine? Oh, wow. And then you have Homo sapiens. So this is from 40,000 years ago, and this is, of course, our prototype people. So this is a very early humans. So this is, you can see how, even though both are Homo sapienses, but you can see how the skull shape has changed. Wow, look at that. This is actually really cool. Wow. Never seen anything like this. Huh. Quite a change. Okay, let's keep on walking. Okay, so here we have some of the early tools that people residing in Malaysia used. So this is from 72,000 years ago. You know, it's really interesting how no matter where you look in the world, these stone tools sort of start appearing around the same time. It's almost like something happened and then boom, you know, we figured out how to carve these things out and use them as tools. Of course, first humans were hunter and gatherer communities, so you know there would be no stock. We would just hunt, and that would of course sort of limit you on how much population you can have, because you would always be dependent upon next day's hunt. You can't predict. There's no crops, there's no cattle barns, right? So you have to each day go and fight for your food. Here we go into Neolithic age, so 4,000 years ago, getting closer. As you can see, the tools are getting much more sophisticated, much more fine-tuned. This is actually quite neat, because usually you just see these like these in museums, but this is what it would actually look like. This is how they would be used. They would be mounted on sticks and used as sort of makeshift hammers and axes. Neolithic age. Yeah, look at this, the complexity is going up. You have pottery emerging. Wow, look at this. So this is what it would look like, the originality. Okay, still more pots from Neolithic era. Here we have the showcase of the earliest paintings that were found on the rocks here in Malaysia, in the region of let's see where, Gua Tambun. What strikes me interestingly is see those boats. Instantaneously, what that sort of reminded me of are these boats that we saw in Norway from the Bronze Age. You know, sort of same visualization. So I wonder if these had religious meaning as well, or if they were just, you know, portraying the way of life at the time. But look at this. Here we have a very unique look at what life was like 10,000 years ago. Look at this. So this would be a cave, which is where, you know, a lot of the early humans' settlements were made, you know, perfect for covering from rain and storms and hot weather. And you can keep it warm and in times of cold by a little fire. And so here we see the remains of what is known as a Perak man, which is one of the, not one, but the best found Homo sapiens example in Malaysia. Look at this. You can almost see the complete skeleton, and it is said that he was buried with full honors. He was about 40 years old and was a really probably venerated full member of the commune. But yeah, look at this. So this is remains of our early ancestors, and this would be the same sort of branch that would later go and habitize the Australia island. And so, but what a unique look at what humanity looked like 10,000 years ago here in Malaysia. Now, in this exhibition, what I really like and what I didn't notice at the beginning is you can see the replicas of what some of the paintings would look like. Look at that. There we have the boats. Again, what a striking resemblance to what we saw in Norway. It's almost, you know, if I didn't know that this is not Norwegian rock bronze paintings, I would think they are. And you can see other ones. So these are of course not originals, but they basically are direct replicas of what you can find if you go to these places around Malaysia. So there's people dancing. Here's more rock paintings. Very interesting. Look at that. Wow. It's telling stories of hunts and battles and perhaps celebration, great moves of the tribe, you know, definitely of ancestors. Very interesting. One thing I wanted to point out is in a lot of cases in these caves where you see the paintings is actually a focal point of the sound. So the researchers kind of sort of took notice of where the paintings were, and they're like, well, why are they here and not on the other wall in the cave? And they recreated some sounds, like they sang or howled, and it turned out that the sound used to reverberate the most at the point where the paintings were found. And you know, our ears are not developed in a way where we hear a lot of reverberation of sound usually. So when we hear that, it sort of tells us that something unreal is happening. You know, it brings that little element of divinity into it. You know, you hear the reflection of the sound as it jumps from wall to wall, amplifies and starts ringing differently, and that sort of would sort of induce the trance that a ritual would produce. In fact, you can see that, you can find that when you go to modern day basilicas. So if you go to a really good basilica and you hear a choir, you can sort of hear the sounds coming from different places. Maybe you'll come from far right wall and left wall behind you, and almost sounds like it's coming from outside the basilica itself. That's because the sound is jumping all around the building and creating this effect. And that sort of plays on our ear, on our hearing, and creates that sensation of mystery, of divinity, of something beyond explanation happening. And this is what actually was done in these caves. They would find a spot where the sound would be the best, and they would paint the paintings, and sort of, you know, during the rituals, the leader of the group or the shaman would walk up there and, you know, do the chants or the howling or whatever they did. It's hard to say. We don't have evidence of what the rituals were, but and so in that point you would sort of get that special effect of the sound. Here's another really interesting fact. What you can see is an example of megaliths. So these are large slabs of stone that would be placed upon the graves or upon living areas, and they would sort of be placed in honor of somebody, but also they would be placed to protect the place from the evil spirits. And as you can see, some of them resemble the humanistic features. And I think behind me here we have two great examples of such stones. Look at these elaborate ones. Wow, I think these ones are probably a little bit newer than the ones I just showed you, because you can see the sophistication of these. But you know what this of course reminds me of is again, you know, when we're looking at these great runic stones in Norway, and you know, basically same purpose and same style. Obviously you don't see runes on these ones, but again, it's the same point, right? You have some art pictured here depicting gods and deities that would protect the place. I don't see any writings here. I'm not sure if the writing already existed at that point here, but you know, obviously same kind of idea. You place a stone and that would sort of glorify the deceased or protect the place of dwelling. So it's quite unique to look at these and find them here on the other side of the world, and just makes you again realize just how united we are at the basis as humans and what we do in our rituals. So after we exit the prehistoric era, we get into a proto-historic period, and that started sort of in early AD. And with that we can see the emergence of Hinduism and Buddhism ideologies as they kind of flowed through the trade routes from India through China through Malaysia. The route was from India to China, but it went through Malaysia. That was known at the time as a Golden Peninsula, and we can see these early artifacts from sort of 400 AD as this replica of a stone. The original is in India, but that was found here in Malaysia. So then we have a development of Hinduism and Buddhism here in Malaysia, and that went up all the way to the 15th century, where the Islam came to Malaysia, and Malay Sultanate was formed. These are the remnants of sort of the first 15 centuries AD in Malaysia. So here's a beautiful example of a proto-historic time burial. So we can see here's the member of society buried here with some of his personal items such as pottery, shells, some jewelry. Quite unique. Wow, this is quite a unique exhibit because it shows us quite a few different styles of burial in Malaysia. Here's a Dongson burial, so there would be large bronze drums buried in the mounds like these, and this would be reserved sort of for the high of the society. This tradition is believed to be brought to Malaysia from North Vietnam. Another would be the stone slab burials, which are quite famous, and you know, can be found all over the world, but these would be dated to 300 BC to 1400 AD, and this is sort of how they would look when they would be found. And you would have the wood log coffins, and sort of these would appear about 1,000 years ago. But this one is rather simple, but actually when most of them are found, they would be quite exquisite. As you can see, they would be ornamented and maybe made into different styles of animals. And this one is very interesting as well. The jar or urn burials. So there was actually two types of them. They date all the way back to 2nd century BC, but there's instances, of course, where you know, bodies would be burned and then the ash of the bones would be placed in one of these pots. What is interesting that one pot would contain ashes of multiple people, so they were sort of shared burials. But also there's another practice that was practiced in Sabah, And what would happen is, the body of the deceased would be carried to a secluded place away from the feral animals, and it would be left there to decompose until nothing was left but the bones. And then the bones would be put in the jars like this, and then they would be carried to remote places in the jungle and left there. And usually there would be megalith structures sort of put beside them that we saw a little bit earlier, signifying the place of a burial. So quite interesting. And here we can see artifacts from the Bujang Valley. That was a home of the earliest kingdom in Malaysia. So this kingdom, Malay kingdom, sort of existed from 4th to 14th century AD. And as we can see, here are some of its artifacts. And of course, it is needless to say, we see the Hindu and the Buddhist influences here. And that was, of course, sort of the primary religious ideology here in Malaysia at the time, since the trade routes and migration zones were interconnected with India quite closely. And here's actually an example of what a temple would have looked like in these days here in Malaysia. There was about 60 of these temples discovered in the Bujang Valley, which is a really important historical site here in Malaysia. But yeah, it just gives you a little glimpse of what the beginning of AD looked like for Malaysia, and just gives you a little glimpse. Very interesting. Yeah, here's more artifacts. They're just pictures, but you can see, of course, how similar they look to the Indian ones with the stupas and Sanskrit writing and whatnot. And now we enter the Islamic era in Malaysia. So Islam came to place in 15th century here in Malaysia and became the dominant religion, and still stays that till today. So here we can see a makara, which is a symbolic sort of creature, a cohesion of elements of two creatures. And they possess sort of magical powers, and these monuments would be placed in the entrances to the temples and palaces. Here are the examples of the foundations for the pillars of the temples of Hindus and Buddhists. So they would be placed on them. Here's the foundations as they're left today, but of course you would have an actual temple made out of wood standing on top of that. But even in those early days of when Malaysia was Buddhist and Hinduist, there was still presence, of course, of other religions. This is a Ibnu Sardan stone. It is not dated here, but it's obviously after 7th century, and it's quite simple, but it provides evidence that different religions existed at the time here already. Here's some more artifacts of the time, some of which are ceremonial and some of which were used in battles. But some of these actually originate in Indonesia, which is really not far from Malaysia. So a lot of the culture is sort of intertwined in those early days, such as this ship, for example, called Majapahit Bahtera. And it is sort of dating to 13th century. It was conceptualized in Indonesia, and it was as you can see, a really convoluted design, but it allowed the sailors to sail extraordinary distances and sort of colonize different areas to add to the kingdom. So How cool is that? Model of a ship from the 13th century. Here we have a representation of wall ornaments as were found in Candi Borobudur temple in Indonesia, and we will actually be going to that temple later, so we'll see the originals. But this sort of signifies well, this portrays Raja Sudhodhana and his spouse Queen Maya, and this sort of symbolizes that the society at the time in the Malay kingdoms accepted monarchy. So we can sort of figure out from symbols like these that these kingdoms, early kingdoms here, Hindu kingdoms, were in fact monarchy kingdoms in the Malay region. Here we have, of course, the famous kris, which is a staple of Malay royalty insignia. So these were both weapons, but also symbols of authority. As you can see, they're heavily ornamented with ivory and gold. And just look at this one. Look at this X. It's made out of ivory, just so detailed. It's mesmerizing to look at. There's gemstones in the handle of this one. Right, so I'm not sure how great they would be at fighting, but of course that's not the point. The point was that this would be the belongings of a king, and in fact these symbols are still till this day a part of Malaysian and Indonesian royalty. So cool to see. Sort of what like a staff of a king would be. You know, this would be the equivalent here in Malay kingdoms. Of course, the main source of the wealth of the Malay kingdoms was the trade, situated in a perfect location between India and China. Extensive trade port location, and with that, you know, spices flowed through and from Malaysia, and this would enrich not only the kingdom but the country surrounded with Malaysian goods and whatnot. So this is where the wealth came, because they were wealthy kingdoms. So what is quite important to remember is that, of course, in the 7th century, you have emergence of Islam, and throughout the centuries to fall, it spread quite quickly, going all around, but mostly to the east, and it sort of flowed through the Silk Road from Middle East to India and further down east. And what it resulted in, and why it flowed that way, is because that's where most of the settlements were, but also the trade routes were along the Silk Route. And eventually, by the 15th century, Islam arrived in Malaysia. And here marks the end of Hindu Buddhism period in Malaysian history, and begins a new one of Islam. And it's really interesting because it wasn't done, well, it was done for two reasons. First, because of the belief of the ruler that this would be the right religion. And of course, second is because it was also financially a really good decision, because exception of Islam at the time would attract Islamic merchants. And by that time, most of the Silk Road west would be controlled by Islamic merchants. So when the kingdom of Malacca were converted, it attracted large quantities of Islamic merchants, enriching the Malaysian peninsula tremendously. And here's a really important scene I wanted to show you. Here is a replica of the moment when the ruler of Malacca, which at the time was still Hindu, was converted by Said Abdul Aziz, a religious scholar from Jeddah, and one of his followers. So you can just imagine what it was like, right? Like a deeply Hinduistic society that was such for 1,500 years, and what a rapid and a paramount change the Islamization brought, because everything changes: your art, the ideology, the beliefs, right? And this is sort of the starting point. You can still see the ruler sort of sitting in the traditional garments of the Malay kingdom at the time, and the Arab style clothing right here. And this is where it all happened. This is where Malaysia went from Hindu to being Islamic. And it stays that way till today. So as soon as we have Islam becoming the religion of the area, we see this influx of different sort of goods coming in. You know, the area is open to Islamic merchants, and you can see almost instantly, you know, products like these coming from far west, well, Middle East, but from Malaysia, far west. Yes, you see the style of clothes changing. So here we have what became the new wear of the Malaysian Sultanate, not a kingdom but a sultanate now. Islam not only brought a new religion to the region, but it also brought sort of intellectual revolution. So a lot of ancient scholars were coming from Islamic territories in the Middle East, like Iran and Iraq, right? A lot of science and that age enlightenment was coming from those areas, and so that sort of came to Malaysia as well. And so the Sultanate of Malacca became sort of one of the most important scholarly destinations, and with that we can see the flourishing of the culture and the art, right? These beautiful ornaments and jewelry and learning that sort of came with it became a new part of Malaysian lifestyle. And here we can see a very unique exhibit, the Royal Throne of Perak. Of course, this is a replica, but an amazing one. And this is the throne that is used to install sultans since the 1918. So you have His Royal Highness Sultan Iskandar Shah, the 30th Sultan of Perak, being the first one that was installed on this throne, and the other sultans to follow after him. Look how beautiful this is. I just wanted to show you a few more beautiful artifacts that I found. So here we have a beautiful scent bottle and a gold tobacco box. Both are tobacco boxes from the 18th century. Both are from 18th century actually. Look how beautifully they're made. So nice. Here's an example of carices. What we saw earlier, sort of this dates back all the way to the Malay Hindu kingdom, but you know, it's quite a unique feature, and it still stayed a part of the Malaysian royalty even with transition to Islam, and it's now worn by sultans, as well as this beautifully ornamented waist buckles. Look how they shine in the light. Just sort of bending here, but just beautiful. Wow, this is about 100 years old. Here we have a really unique coinage. You see different tin coinages from the history here. So as the time passed, you know, the Sultanate of Malacca grew, and it was a very, very powerful sultanate in this part of East Asia. However, you know, with colonization, that came to an end in 1699. The last Malay Empire was broken up, and the colonial power sort of took over. But these are some of the artifacts from Malacca Sultanate and the kingdom surrounded, because you know, not all the areas turned to Islam. As you can see, Vietnam, that is not far away, the Thailand, that is also not far away, stayed as Buddhists and Hindus, and so you can see just the diversity of all these surrounding kingdoms that surround Malaysia. And how intertwined they are. Now, Malay kingdoms were not just in the peninsula, but were also on the surrounding islands like Brunei, and they were quite prevalent until the fall of Brunei's caliphate in the 19th century. But just wanted to show you a few more artifacts as found here in the museum. As you see, there's always a combination of Chinese symbolism and Indian and Islamic art. So really, there's so much diversity in Asia. It is hard to sort of pinpoint where what comes from, because so much trade was done through these areas. And now we walk into a new chapter in Malaysian history, the Portuguese Malaysia. So what happened was in the 15th century, the King of Portugal sent his voyage to a Sultanate of Malacca, but something went wrong and the voyagers were captured. However, they were able to escape, and but many died in the process. So when the King of Portugal heard of that, got really angry and was like, okay, well, I'm gonna send my armada. And that's what he did. The Portuguese came here in 1511, and after hard resistance from the Sultan at the time, Sultan Ahmad, the Sultan of Malacca was conquered, and thus started the colonization of this area by Portugal. So here you would see sort of what it was like from a Portuguese ship. These are Portuguese sailors and soldiers, and there's a coast of the Caliphate. And as you see, the Armada is coming up. You can imagine what it must have looked like to see these kind of ships on the horizon, right? Probably bigger ships than were present there before. You know, who knows how many of them? I know the number, but Armada sounds like there was quite a few, to say the least. Well, and so of course, as Portuguese came the Christianity. So of course, soon you would have Christian chapels and churches being raised here in what was Malacca Caliphate before. And of course, people being deeply Islamic didn't like that. So soon the resistance started. And so Portuguese came here in 1511. So by the mid of 17th century, so about a little more than 100 years from then, they were eventually defeated. And they weren't just defeated by the Malay people themselves, who sort of retreated to the south point of Malaysian peninsula and formed a Johor caliphate there, independent of Portuguese rule. But they were also assisted by the Dutch. The Dutch wanted to get the peninsula for themselves because it's a very important trade route, and they were more accepting of the Sultanate. So together with Johor Sultanate and the Dutch, the Spaniards were defeated, as portrayed right here. And these are some of the weapons that were left by the Portuguese at the time. There is this is sort of the replicas of what the Portuguese missions, I guess, would have liked here in the conquered land. Here's a bit about the Johor Caliphate. Here's a sultan of the Johor Caliphate, and they were instrumental in defeating the Portuguese together with Dutch, and for their help. Their trade in the Straits of Straits of Malacca were largely left undisturbed. What is this? Oh, and here we walk into the Dutch times. So after the defeat of the Portuguese came the Dutch. And with it came its own administration, its own beliefs, and artifacts like such as these Dutch weapons, as we can see, and the style of the furniture and everything to come with it. So they were actually in charge of the territory from 1641 to 1824. So again, very large influence from the Netherlands here. But then, in the end of that, came the British, and it was the East India Company was expanding further from India into the east. At first they got Penang, then Singapore, and eventually Malacca. Sort of changed hands a few times. The English occupied Malacca for a few years, then went back to the Dutch, but then the English got it for good in 1826, and from then Malaysia was colonized by the British. And here we go. Here's a little exhibit about Penang. I think these are the British cannons. So you can just imagine the sound these would make upon the attack. What is important to realize is that it wasn't a unified state of Malaysia as we know it today. There was territories, there was different sultanates, there was different kingdoms. And so the British administration was sort of like the colonial power here, but at the same time, there was all these different factions of rulers that ruled different territories. And I guess Britain was sort of overseeing how they operated between each other while, keeping the control of the trade and resources here. So in general, British administration didn't seem to have too much trouble, but in fact, the states here, under the British administration, sort of the economic, transportation and communication and education sectors all enjoyed progress. However, it didn't mean that people were happy, Of course, English were Protestants, and Malaysia was still largely Islamic, and so that didn't quite fit. And so you had some unrest and uneasiness starting to boil, and we'll see how that will turn into something later. And of course, after about 100 years of rule by the British, we get to the Japanese occupation. So comes World War II, year 1941, Japan attacks the Malaysia Peninsula. It seizes it quite quickly. It does a pretty good advanced strategy, and by 1942 basically gets control of all of Malaysia. It was a brutal 4 years that Malaysia was in the occupation. What happened was a few factors. So when British were retreating, they went on the scorched earth policy. So they destroyed a lot of crops, a lot of goods, and so people were missing food, missing resources. The Japanese were quite strict in their administration. So you had a Kempeitai secret police sort of monitoring the streets and houses in Malaysia, killing and torturing people if they were not compliant with the regime. And especially the Chinese population was treated very poorly here in Malaysia by the Japanese as compared to Indians and Malay people. So as a result of these 4 brutal years under the Japanese colonization, Malaysia sort of went and said, okay, well, guys, this is enough. Like, it's been, almost 500 years of colonial rule. We had enough. And as the World War II ends, Malaysia starts thinking of independence, of freedom from colonial overlords. So it is the end of World War II. The Japanese are defeated after the drop of atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as a result, the British get Malaysia back. And what they propose is something called Malayan Union, Malayan Union. And what that was supposed to do is strip the sultans of some of the powers, but in exchange grant Malaysians sort of the citizenship to the empire. However, this was no longer accepted by Malayan people themselves. They wanted something different, and so as a result, we get the Federation of Malaya in 1948, and this is sort of the first shadow of what Malaysia is going to be. So basically, they pushed back the British and started building their own framework of governance, which led to the negotiation for independence. So starting from 1948, Malaysia started forming unions and organizations that basically started pushing back the British and started to build their own infrastructure for the Malaysian independence. So fast forward a bit, 1955, Malaysia holds its first general election as a federation. It's contended, as you can see, lots of different leaders are being elected. It's quite a real deal. Of course, as you can see, still partially administrated by the British, but sort of the next step in the process. And then in 1956, just a year after the election, the Malaysia sends their delegation to London to negotiate for independence. It took 3 weeks, but after 3 weeks, they got what they wanted, and they returned to a jubilant crowd in the Malacca. Over 100,000 people were lined up, cheering in jubilation and shouting, "Merkeda, Merkeda." And on August 31st, 1957, Malaysia proclaimed its independence. As you can see here, some of the newspapers of the time celebrating the independence. What is unique is that this negotiation was done by three organizations: United Malayan National Organization, Malaysian Chinese Association, and Malayan Indian Congress, which are the three main races that lived in Malaysia at the time, and they sort of solved their differences, said let's all live in peace, put any racial divisions aside, and form a unified Malaysia. And that's exactly what they did. And on the August 31st in 1957, a year after the independence was proclaimed, Malaysia got its flag, which is still used today. It's a little bit different than what we see today, but basically that's when the flag came to be. And then we had, of course, the proclamation of independence. And then finally, celebration of the full independence. So I have to correct myself. When they went to London, what they got, it was the self-rule, but that was in 1956. But by 1957, we have the jubilant independence. Finally, after 500 years, the Malaysian people got their freedom. They got the freedom to select what they want to do, how they want to do, what religion they want to follow. As you can see, there's British dignitaries present at the independence ceremony. I think the first Prime Minister of Malay Tunku Abdul Rahman giving his speech. And of course, you can imagine people shouting everywhere, Merdeka, 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 which is basically independence, independence, independence. Here we can see actually a very cool exhibit, which is a different royal headdresses that the kings of Malaysia wore over the times. Quite unique. Very interesting. Definitely different from what you see sort of in the surrounding areas. Wow.
Sengaja asing-asingkan kita. Wujudlah kita saling mempercayai satu sama lain. Dan miskin pula tak ada sekolah tinggi. Peluang untuk belajar pada masa itu tak senang macam hari ini. Tapi wujudlah kita karya dengan idea bangsa lain. India dan China. Mereka kami itu.
Apa maksud tu? Macam piramid? Tu macam orang.
Yang kita ni berbilang tahu. Dulu pun macam itu juga. Sebab kita berbagai bangsa. Untuk dapat kemerdekaan kita kena bersatu. Jadi tempuhlah hero kita pada masa itu. Dia dipercayai dan dihormati oleh semua. Dialah peraturan bapak kemerdekaan kita.
So fast forwarding a little further, we have the formation of Malaysia in 1963 as a state. And it was actually a combination of a few states, Sabah, Sarawak, Singapore, and the Federation of Malaysia that got its independence that we talked about a little bit earlier. Somewhat of necessity because the new entity had to be economically viable and strategically placed, so that's why it was proposed to bring the four together and form Malaysia. As you can imagine, the formation of such a big country definitely worried some of its neighbors, such as Indonesia. They were kind of fearing that maybe this is a new colonial power rising right at their doorstep. But luckily, there was peace talks done in 1966, so that crisis has passed. At the same time, you had the Philippines claiming Sabah for themselves, but that was not honored at the time, and that's still a part of Malaysia today. But of course, one of the last events that sort of formed Malaysia as we know it today was a separation of Singapore from Malaysia. And that was due to some differences in culture and racial tensions. Singapore, being primarily largely Chinese population, was had almost no other racial representation in the area. And as a result, when it became part of Malaysia, there was racial tensions, and actually in 1964, 30 people got killed and 260 injured. As a result, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tunku Abdul Rahman, decided that, to forego any further bloodshed, it would just be best to let Singapore go and Malaysia to stay as it is. And so that's what happened on August 9th, 1965, and Singapore left the union with Malaysia and became its own nation, while Malaysia continued to be the country, and the borders largely, hasn't changed since then, and that's the Malaysia we know today. And here's a great big map of Malaysia. As you can see, it is huge. There's of course the peninsular Malaysia, and we are here in Kuala Lumpur, but you can see the Malacca, which is the place where the main sultanate was at for many years, and Johor Sultanate, where the Malacca Sultanate escaped to when the Portuguese came. But this is the peninsula area, and then we also have the island area of Sarawak, Labuan, and Sabah, which are also a part of Malaysia but are islands. As you can see, it's a really, really big country that was put together not so long ago, but it lives in harmony and peace with three large ethnographics of Indian, Chinese, and Malay people. Here's the beautiful Tengkolok Diraja, meaning royal headdress of the ruler of all of Malaysia. So what is really interesting about Malaysian form of government is that it is a constitutional monarchy. It is actually not a complete monarchy, but a not complete parliamentary system. This largely resembles what we have in the United Kingdom. However, there are some differences. So the king is actually not elected based on the family lineage. The king is actually elected by the conference of Malay rulers, which are different sultans from different regions within Malaysia. And so each one, as I understand, gets sort of their turn. There might be a line, or maybe there's some factors that can speed track a certain member, but basically different sultans get their chance to rule over Malaysia at different times. However, in each individual sultanate, the royalty is passed by the family. So there's a hereditary royalty in each of sultanates. However, the overall supreme king, or what should be properly called, or the title that should be properly called, Yang di Pertuan Agong, Yang di Pertuan Agong, is selected by the conference of Malay rulers. And then we also have the parliament, which consists of the parliament and the senate, like in any other constitutional, like in any other parliamentary democracy. And then, of course, there's parliament, which is elected in the elections, and there's also a senate. So like in any other parliamentary democracy, sort of the same thing, but we have an elected king as well. What's interesting to know is that king is actually still is the supreme commander of armed forces. He's also a head of religion in the federal territories and some other territories, and he approves of a lot of things, such as appointments of cabinet minister and members of parliament. However, of course, the royalty gives up some of its influence, such as the defense and the finance and some administration of the affairs to the parliament. So that's sort of how it works. And as we walk out, here's an example of diverse, beautiful Malaysian dress wear. Look how diverse everything is. You can see all the religions here. There's Catholic, there's Christians that are still a part of religion scenery here in Malaysia. There's Buddhist and Hindus and Islam, of course. All right, guys. Well, we are done our tour of the National Museum of Malaysia. Boy, that was a treat. What a great museum. All right, guys. Well, we have finished our tour of the National Museum of Malaysia, and as you can see, I'm wearing a traditional Malaysian headwear. It's called Tanjak, or you can also name it Pendam Tak Sudah, which translates to unfinished revenge. I don't know. Maybe I do have an unfinished revenge. We'll have to find out, but that's what it's called, and it's pretty awesome. This sort of symbolizes love, and the color is sort of that sultans use. So I think we made the right pick. But I just wanted to say a few words about the museum itself. It's a fantastic museum. If you're in Kuala Lumpur, definitely stop by. I mean, it really shows you, like, it's just a perfect amount of information. You can absorb it. You can actually read it. You will learn a lot of things. You will learn about history of Malaysia from the very beginnings, like half a million years ago to today. And you will learn about the colonization periods and the fight for independence. And it will just make you perceive Malaysia in a different light. It is beautiful culture. You see how it sort of blossomed from one to another. And what struck me the most is that Malaysian independence was a largely peaceful movement, and that is something important to point out and to be proud of. And just the amount of different cultures, one way or the other, some through colonization, so not so positive, but also, that's history. So as a result, you have Malaysia really be a sort of a kitchen of ideas, a kitchen of cultures, and you can see that in life here when you look at the artwork, the food, the language itself. You can see so many connections to so many other cultures, and this museum really puts it nicely. So if you have the time, stop by here. You'll like it. Peace. And actually from here, I just wanted to show you, this is the highest building in all of Malaysia, and I think maybe in all of Asia. I'll have to check on that one, but there it is. Sort of looks like one gigantic router. So there you go.